Hello, welcome to my older adult video presentation by Lisa Bell, Social Work 501. Let me take a minute just to introduce my interviewee. He's my father-in-law, 69 years old, and he was adopted as an infant. His parents were both retired military and in their mid-40s. He also had a younger sister that was adopted that he wasn't very close with. His mother was prior Army nurse, and his father was a prior Navy Seabee. He grew up in a middle-class small town in Pensacola, Florida, and still lives near there today. My interviewee didn't know he was adopted until he was 35 years old when his adopted mother told him then. He often spoke about the disconnect and loneliness that he felt with his adopted parents and environment, and he didn't know why until he was 35. I chose Erikson's first stage of trust versus mistrust of psychosocial framework to analyze my interviewee because I felt this was the best stage to fit his lifespan. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade and started working for a sand and gravel company that his father owned. He is now a successful general contractor building and repairing homes in the Pensacola and Gulf Breeze areas. He built his own house for his family when he was in his 40s, and he plans on retiring in 2 to 3 years once he is able to meet his financial goals to do so. I chose trust versus mistrust because I think it was the most applicable for my interviewee's lifespan. The first stage of Erikson's psychosocial development that occurs from birth to 18 months old, and this stage is about the development of trust with adults or the caregiver. Hopefully, infants learn that caregivers can be counted on to provide availability and predictability. If needs are not met at this stage, the initial mistrust of caregivers extends to other attachment figures throughout the lifespan. And I think that this pretty much explains the avoidant behavior and the lack of trust that my interviewee felt throughout his whole life. So I felt this was the best stage to explain his lifespan. Important experiences were that the interviewee was given up for adoption at birth, and the lack of trust during infancy with biological mother or adopted parents. The adopted mother was very kind and loving, and interviewee was unable to reciprocate emotion, and this made him very distraught throughout his life. He often questioned if there was something wrong with him, that he lacked this bond with his adopted mother, and made him question his capability of loving others. So he was often avoidant of relationships outside of his environment due to this. So disconnect and lack of attachment or affection between interviewee and others during lifespan. He dropped out of high school in 10th grade. And this time it was more important to follow with the legacy of your family and the family's name than it was to get an education. So that's what he did. He dropped out of high school and started working for his father. And he found out in 35 that he was adopted. So not until his adopted mother felt ill and wasn't sure how much longer she had did she want to tell him that he was adopted. But when he found out he was adopted, it was a sigh of relief for him because he finally knew why that connection and that bond wasn't there or as deep as he had always felt his whole life. In that moment, he finally understood that there were things beyond his control due to genetics or predisposition that led him to be the way that he was. He also found out that his mother, his biological mother, was someone that was always around. She gave birth to him in his adopted mother's home. So there was a very quick handoff from birth to the adopted parents. She left his life, but then came back and would often visit every couple of weeks, and talk with him. And he just assumed this was a friend of his adopted mother's. He didn't know this was his biological mother. So there was no real relationship there. Challenges and accomplishments. The research through my annotated bibliography showed me that the trust that's built in infancy allows for growth outside of nurturing environment. So when this trust is not built with the caregiver, this connection and this mistrust through your lifespan continues. And I think you can really see that very clearly in my father-in-law's case. So the lack of relationships and connections with others and environment through his whole lifespan. So avoidant behavior with others, with the environment, with school and work. Money became more important than education. He got married at a young age, and they have been married for 49 years, and they have 2 children. The connection that he has with his sons is a loving connection, but not as deep of connection that he wishes he did have. And he is a business owner, general contractor. The psychosocial crisis. Adopted mother was dependable, caring, and loving. And because the handoff was near birth, you would assume or make the assumption that there would have been enough caring and dependability there to reassure the trust building at an early age. But for some reason, this did not occur. So he did not build this trust relationship with his caretaker or his biological mother, and this loneliness and isolation continued through adulthood and inability to build interdependence outside of family. The inability to build outside relationships and lack of positive transactions. His parents were older and in their 40s, and he often spent his days on the farm. They owned quite a bit of land in Pensacola, Florida, and his mom often bought wild animals or monkeys, horses, donkeys into their environment, and that's how he spent his days, playing and interacting with animals and avoiding human connection. The biosocial factors that may have facilitated or inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial crisis, diversity and differences. His biological mother was pregnant at a young age, and his biological father is unknown. These circumstances could have led to her giving the child up for adoption. She was young, and because she did not know the father, she didn't have any support. And in these times, this was not conducive for a young teenager to bring a child into this world. Genetic vulnerabilities are unknown due to being adopted. Low coping and social skills due to mistrust in others. An indulgent parenting style by adopted parents. His parents, as I previously said, his adopted parents were overindulgent because they could tell that his emotional needs were not being met. So they went overboard with the other aspects in his life to see what they could do to get those needs met by buying him the car, the donkeys, the horses, whatever they could to make him feel loved. So this did not help him create a more trustworthy environment for his future. This just reinforced his behavior. Biopsychosocial factors that may have facilitated or inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial crisis as far as oppression. The interviewer was a white male, but he dropped out of high school when he was in 10th grade. So where he didn't see oppression when he was growing up, I think oppression once he hit middle adulthood or emerging adulthood was probably the case. He had a lack of resources available to him. He married young, and they didn't have a lot of money, and the economy, it's a small town, so he was in a lower socioeconomic status at that point in his life. So where it didn't affect him as a young adult, it did, or a young child in adolescence, it did affect him in the young adult, emerging adulthood stage. So he was raised in a middle-class, blue-collar family. His adopted parents, his adopted mother was a retired military nurse, but worked in the local hospital in Pensacola, Florida, after retiring from the Army, and his father owned a construction company, which is another reason why they had such a large acreage of land, because he had a sand and gravel company that was very successful, and they often had to use the sand and gravel from their own yard to fill orders. So they had lots of holes and lots of areas for young children to run around and play in. He experienced lots of joy, and those are fond memories that he has, probably starting about age 8, of running around with the environment, the forest, and the clay pits, and so forth. So he grew up exploring this environment alone, and that's why he's pretty avoidant with other people. The larger social forces that come into play with these biopsychosocial factors that may have facilitated and inhibited the resolution of his psychosocial crisis were that this was a small southern city and it wasn't diverse or educated. Most residents were hardworking and blue collar. They all worked construction and so forth, or seafood industry. So there wasn't necessarily normal or the average thing to go out and further your education. So, and inhibited is his future education. The other theory that I chose to speak about my interviewee and his lifespan was the attachment theory. I think it was pretty clear in choosing this theory to discuss his lifespan because the positive attachment and the secure attachment was not built at infancy. And so therefore he expressed an insecure attachment to his caregiver, and his insecure attachment led lifelong implications. And this avoidant behavior lasted throughout adulthood, and lack of interdependent relationships. He didn't have a need for these relationships growing up because he was isolated on a large acreage, and he just depended on his mom and dad, and that was it. So he really was not able to build these trustworthy relationships necessary for further growth in his lifespan.